everybody, and welcome to Classical Stuff You Should Know. We are a podcast that aims to bring the classical world to you in as painless a way as possible. So we talk about old philosophies, old books, old things, and try to make it fun. And my name is AJ Hannenberg, and I'm here with my compatriots, Graeme Donaldson.
Hi.
And Thomas Fletcher Magby.
Hello.
And today we get to talk about a famous instance in England when a fellow named Henry got a little too drunk on a fifth of vodka, and he wandered home through someone else's garden and trampled all over their plants.
That's unfortunate.
So the next day, that man who happened to be a Frenchman got some gasoline out of his car and poured it all over Henry V's garden and then lit it on fire, burning all of his plants. And thus began the War of the Roses, which would continue a prank war between these two guys for a couple of years.
For years and years, and it
Yeah.
became enmeshed in history forever.
Yeah.
That's right.
Yep, I'm excited to hear about Henry V and his hijinks.
We have years ago.
So all of that's wrong, by the way. None of that's true.
Years ago,
What?
we started a series on Classical Stuff You Should Know about the history of the Plantagenet kings, starting from basically Henry I all the way up to, I don't remember where we stopped. We stopped with the disposing of Richard II.
Deposition of Richard II.
Yeah. No,
Can you
where
imagine?
It's pretty tough.
Sitting
That's
through that?
Yeah. No, where we got Richard II, where he was thrown out and then replaced by a different king. That's where we sort of ended.
Is Henry V that very last king?
No.
Okay.
We didn't get to Henry V. We haven't got to
I think his name was mentioned at the very, very end.
It probably was, yes. Henry V, yeah. So, because it's probably, it's been a while since you guys heard the story, I'm just going to back up a little bit and, to start the story,
back the thing up.
this is a tragedy. So the story that we're going to be telling is probably the roughest period in English history. Maybe the Civil War is
Isn't
pretty
this
bad.
period you're talking about like a huge, long chunk of history? How many hundreds of years is it?
Not a long hunt. No, it's 3 generations. No, there are people at the beginning of this story.
Wait, are we talking War of the Roses or the
War of the
Plantagenets?
We're talking War of the Roses.
Oh, I thought you meant the Plantagenets.
No, the
I was like,
Plantagenets
isn't
is
that
hundreds of
most
years.
the?
But we're talking about the War of the Roses, which is, sort of...
Like 30 years.
30 year, this huge chunk of history. It begins with Richard II and ends with Richard III, and the beginning of a new house, the House of Tudor. And that House of Tudor is where we get the famous Tudor king, Henry VIII, right? Leading up, and then his daughter, Elizabeth I, and then that's the era of Shakespeare. So, to tell this story, we are, since it is a giant tragedy, we are going to start at the beginning, which is going to be sort of happy times. And that is the reign of Edward III. We covered this in a podcast, so we're not going to talk about the reign of Edward III. Suffice to say, a quick review is that Edward III was a strong and good king. And people loved him, and he had a long rule.
He's not one of the Shanks? Isn't that another Longshanks?
That was Edward II.
Second.
Yeah, so
Apologies.
Edward III had a long rule, and he had many sons who were all able, quality men who rose to positions of great authority. So he had a large family, and this is going to end up becoming the seeds of the problem down the line for the War of the Roses. So if you will remember, Edward III had a son that was known as the Black Prince because he wore awesome black armor, and he was this great warrior.
You listen to death metal?
And everyone was super jazzed that the Black Prince was one day going to be king, and because he was amazing. And then, as he was a young man, he had a young family, a little baby. And then he was fighting a war in Portugal against Pedro, King Pedro IV, I think it was. I don't know if it was the fourth, but it was King Pedro, which is a hilarious name.
Was he the Cruel?
Pedro the Cruel. I don't quote. We have to go back and listen to it. I had all the notes then. I can't remember which Pedro it was, but he dies.
Yeah.
Henry, the Black Prince dies early and has this wonderful speech which we read that about the Wheel of Fortune and how you can be in the sun one day and then everything is taken from you and then you're a skeleton. And then his little baby became king. He wasn't a baby, he was a little kid, became king. And that was Richard II. And if you remember in that story, Richard II grew up with, as a young man, a young king, a revolt of the peasants who were super down on the aristocracy. They loved the king, but they didn't like the aristocracy. And they blew up the aristocracy's house, John of Gaunt. They blew up his house. And anyway, I'm recapping everything, but Richard II was a king who basically stopped that revolt using his majesty. You remember this, AJ? He came towards everybody and he was like, you guys should stop because I'm king. And all the peasants were like, yeah, that's kind of awesome. And they all put down their arms and stopped. You want to hear about that? You can go listen to the old Plantagenet number 6 or whatever it was of the life of Richard II. His uncle, he had a number of uncles who were the strong men of his father. And then, so Edward III had a bunch of kids. His dad was one of them, and he had all these uncles who were these able-bodied, strong men. 2 of them are going to be principal players in setting up the houses for the War of the Roses. One was John of Gaunt, and he is often associated as the beginning of the House of Lancaster. And then he also had Edmund of Langley, who is also his uncle, who is going to be the head of the House of York. And that comes, so John of Gaunt should have been, okay, so this is where it gets a little bit iffy. When the Black Prince died, he had a kid, which was Richard II, who became king. But there was precedent that John of Gaunt should have been king because he was in his 30s and he was able-bodied and he was smart and capable and noble and in fields of battle he set himself apart. And people were like, we kind of were robbed of this awesome kingdom from the Black Prince. Maybe John of Gaunt should be king. But the custom was that this 7-year-old becomes king. And so they're like, all right, well, we'll just make sure that we'll just surround him with really great people and hopefully he becomes as good a king as his dad was promised to be. Are we tracking so far?
Yep. Yeah, I think so. Do we ever have precedent where a 7-year-old king is just like, I decree I shall never be required to take a bath again? Do you have that kind of stuff?
Well, he has a regent, so he's not technically allowed to totally rule until he becomes a man. And even then, that is a questionable. That's not like when you turn 18. It was when everyone sort of said yeah, you're pretty good at this. Richard II was not considered to have been a man until he was well into his 30s, which is probably vexing for Richard II.
Sure.
But anyway,
is there a committee? The Are You a Man committee?
Yeah, it's the regents. It's these dudes that sit around. They're like, he's kind of crappy. He probably shouldn't be king yet. Anyway, and it can have...
That seems like a good program, actually. You don't want a guy getting to be king when he's still a doofus.
Especially a stinky kid.
Living in his parents' basement.
So John of Gaunt doesn't become king. John of Gaunt seems to be fine with it. But he is a noble lord and... Yeah, cool. Richard II was not a very smart person. Richard II, and you can go back and listen to the episode before, ended that rebellion by appealing to His Majesty, and since that worked, he thought that appealing to His Majesty could sort of solve every problem in his reign. So he was the kind of king that just to establish his authority at the end of dinner parties, he would sit on a chair and just intently stare at people until they bowed to him, and he would do this for hours.
I was wondering, Graeme and Amanda and my wife and I, we all have dinner together every week. I've been wondering why you started
That's why I
doing
do that.
That actually makes a lot more sense
until
now.
your head bows and until you
It made
nod
us really uncomfortable,
in
but now that I
deference.
know that's the reason you're doing
That's
it.
why we do it.
Thank you. Yeah.
So Richard II, not a very great king. He eventually arbitrarily kicked out people from the country because they were strong noble lords and they were sort of whispers that maybe Richard II shouldn't be king. It should maybe go to John of Gaunt. Well, he's not going to be king because he had died at this point. Maybe it should go to John of Gaunt's son, named Henry Bolingbroke. Henry Bolingbroke had this dispute with this other local lord, and they got into a fight, and they were going to have a duel to the death. And they got all psyched up. And so Henry Bolingbroke from the House of Lancaster had his glorious tent all set up, and they were going to have this fight to the death to restore his honor, and then King Richard II was like, stop. Instead of a fight to the death, you're all banished. And he banished Henry Bolingbroke, and I think it was the Duke of Mowbray out of England. And it was pretty arbitrary, and everyone was super upset, because it's like, listen, they wanted to fight to restore their honor, and Richard II's like, I don't care.
And at this point, aren't duels kind of a pretty standard practice?
Duels are pretty standard practice, and this was a big deal. Someone was going to die, and the winner was going to, basically clear his name. and the king stopped it. All right. Henry Bolingbroke leaves England. Duke of Mowbray leaves England too. I can't remember what happened to him. He doesn't really feature in the story. Henry Bolingbroke leaves. And then when his father dies, he is in exile. And Richard II goes and says, hey, John of Gaunt, when John of Gaunt was dying, he's like, John of Gaunt, I'm going to take all your property. I'm not going to give it to your kid. Haha. And John of Gaunt said, I hate you. You suck. If you want to read about this, Richard II has this great scene where John of Gaunt Richard II confronts John of Gaunt, and there's this wonderful scene where Patrick Stewart, that's how I think of John of Gaunt.
Or you think I'm talking about Shakespeare?
Yeah. There's an Amazon series called The Hollow Crown, where John of Gaunt is played by Captain Picard, and that's all I can see in my mind. But anyway, he has this great speech about England, about how you are turning it over to you're like a renter and you're just like sucking the life out of this nation. And King Richard's like, you're old and dying and I don't care. Richard II takes the land. Henry Bolingbroke is ticked. Henry Bolingbroke comes home with an army to get his land back. And everyone's like, oh yeah, he should be king. And Bolingbroke's like, no. I don't want to be king. I just want what's mine back.
I just want my land back.
And everyone's like, oh, that's what a king would say. And he's like, no, I don't really want to be king. But he sort of is like, but I'm going to march my army to the king's palace and demand for what's mine back. Eventually, popular sentiment rode behind Henry. There was some kind of claim to the crown because John of Gaunt was the brother of the dead prince, Black Prince, who could have been king. So people were like, "Oh man, Henry's like."
Oh, John of Gaunt was the brother of the Black Prince?
That's right.
Okay.
Yeah. So he's like, "Oh man, Henry." So Henry and Richard are cousins.
Right.
Everyone's like, "Oh well, Henry. He kind of like looks like a king. He's kind of like awesome. He rides a horse really well." And Richard II is kind of like milquetoast and limp-wristed and like pouty and always is appealing to his authority. And people just didn't really like him. And so it came to a head, and we talked more about the politics behind it with Henry Bolingbroke, with the aid of Parliament and all these other nobles, securing the crown from Richard II. Richard II abdicated and freely gave the crown, I put in air quotes, freely gave the crown to Henry Bolingbroke. Legend has it that in the great meeting where this happened, Richard II talked about the heavy weight of the crown, and when Richard II talked about the heavy weight of the crown when Henry said, "Are you going to give me the crown?" Richard said, "Yes, here it is," and threw it at his feet. And then that scene is immortalized also in Richard II. It is a wonderful scene. And you should, if you are interested in Shakespeare or in this period of history, you should go watch that Hollow Crown version of it. Richard II is played by who's the actor? The guy who plays Q in all the new Bond movies. Wentworth? No. You guys can Google it. What's his name?
Wait, say again. Which character?
Richard II in the Hollow Crown.
Ben Whishaw?
Yeah, Ben Whishaw. He's great. He's an awesome Richard II. And then the guy who plays Henry Bolingbroke, I only know him from a role he played in Black Mirror. So whatever.
Rory Kinnear?
Yeah.
I don't know how you say that.
Anyway, Richard II gives a throne to Henry Bolingbroke, and Henry Bolingbroke becomes Henry IV. Okay, this is where our War of the Roses story is going to start and where our earlier Plantagenet story ended. So I apologize that if you've just finished Plantagenet 6 and you're jumping to this one, you're like, yeah, I know that already. Well, it's been like 2 years since we've talked about this, so...
I don't think there's anyone saying that.
Oh, okay.
It's just been so long. I'm saying. I'm
Gotcha.
not trying to be insulting.
Right.
Just
So now we have Henry Bolingbroke, who has become Henry IV. Oops, knocked the mic. Henry IV was, I kind of think of him as, he was a bit of a bro. He was like good at war. He didn't really like all this like number stuff and this like governing stuff.
I just want my lands back.
He just wanted his lands back, and he just wanted respect and honor. And he also kind of didn't really want to be king.
Why you frontin', bro?
And this is how Winston Churchill describes Henry Bolingbroke in Volume 1 of History of the English-Speaking People. So this is how Henry, he's now known as Henry IV. So this is how Henry IV, the king who took the crown from Richard II, Henry IV from the House of Lancaster, this is how Churchill describes him. In the hour of his ascension, he was still the bold knight, surprisingly moderate in success, avaricious from bloodshed, affianced to growing constitutional ideas, and always dreaming of ending his life as a crusader. But the sullen, turbulent march of events frustrated his tolerant inclinations and eventually soured his generous nature. So he sort of came to the throne. He was good-natured. He didn't like violence, but he was willing to throw down if he had to. And he kind of just wanted everything just to settle down. Richard II was such a turbulent, such an emotional, such a petulant child of a ruler that all Henry IV wanted to do was just kind of have things chill. Just like have things kind of get back to normal. People can raise their families, do their jobs. We can fight the Welsh if we need to. Like let's just not have things be crazy. And immediately, so Parliament, when they saw this, realized, hey, you know what? He's probably open to giving us a little more power and us taking a little bit off his plate. So Parliament came to Henry IV and they're like, hey, how would you feel about limiting your kingship? You can fight wars, and you can do all the like king stuff, but we can deal with like laws and taxes. And Henry IV's like, that's a great idea. He's like, do you guys want to take care of all the money? Because I don't really want to have to think about that. And Parliament was like, we reluctantly accept. Yes, we will take care of all the money. And so he gave them more parliamentary power and they had more sort of authority over the purse. And he's like, you guys will totally give me everything I need during a war, right? And they're like, oh, yes.
I feel like this is what happened with like Nicolas Cage and his tax advisor.
Exactly.
You know what I mean? Like, I don't really want to think about the money. And these guys like, I
will think about it for you.
Yeah.
Right?
I have your best interest at heart. Now, I don't want to disparage Parliament.
Or Nicolas Cage.
Or Nicolas
Nicolas
Cage, for that matter.
If you're listening, Nick.
And definitely in the history of the English-speaking people, Churchill really, part of an axe he's grinding in the whole series is the birth of Parliament, which is kind of a fascinating thread that goes through his entire work. But anyway, Henry IV sort of limits his kingship, and
is it in perpetuity? Will all following kings also have limited leadership?
Yeah, I mean it's these slow glacial moves, but basically Parliament really wanted to hedge against all the crap that happened with Richard II.
Yeah.
Richard II really tried to do the God made me your better, and everything I say should be law, which is where France sort of went with the whole Louis XIV thing. Well, this was England's version of that. And all of the noble lords were like, I don't like the sound of that because
some of the stuff he says.
He says is crazy. And so if we can kind of limit the authority of the power, if we can have some sort of balance of power, well, this is going to be better for everybody. And Henry IV was like, yeah, fine, have more power, that's cool. All right. So much so that one of the nobles was so happy. Actually, it was the Archbishop when Henry IV came into power. He said, "This honorable realm of England, the most abundant angle of riches in the whole world, has been reduced to destruction by the counsels of children and widows," referring to Richard II. Richard II apparently had like very bad counselors, according to the Archbishop. "Now God has sent a man knowing and discreet for governance, who by the aid of God will be governed and counseled by the wise and ancient of his realm." So in other words, he's going to listen to all the smart people in Parliament, and that's how he's going to govern. Things are looking up, boys, for England, now that Henry IV is in charge. Cool.
I'm waiting for the gotcha.
Yeah.
This guy sounds
There's no
pretty
gotcha.
good.
Henry IV is great.
Oh, really?
The gotcha is that he wanted everything to be kind of chill. He just wanted things to kind of go back to normal. But he did overthrow basically the kingdom. There were still people, or Richard II, for whatever reason, was insanely popular with like the peasants, not insanely popular with the nobles. Remember, the peasants were the ones that tried to overthrow the nobles, and when Richard said, "No, my children, stop," they were like, "Oh, king, okay," and they stopped.
Right.
And so Richard II was considered, he was still alive, was in jail somewhere, and people were like, "This is wrong, you shouldn't do this." So Henry IV and his entire court were promptly poisoned. And almost died.
Wow.
And everyone was, and so they were all having dinner one day, and the next day they all got super sick.
Right.
And they thought he was going to die. And everyone was trying to look around for who did this. To this day, we don't really know who tried to poison Henry IV and his entire court.
Sounds like undercooked shellfish to me.
It could have been, but the monarchy decided to blame the Welsh. So they figured the Welsh did it.
Nah, I knew it.
Now, the Welsh were backers of Richard II, not because they loved Richard II, but because they loved instability in England. So if you back the guy that just got ousted, you can kind of stir up some trouble. And so Henry IV, who is first and foremost a soldier, when he recovered, he's like, we got to throw down with the Welsh. This is what we got to do. And meanwhile, one of the Welsh noblemen who was sort of the leader of the rebellion against Henry IV was a man by the name of Owen Glendower, and he was sort of a very interesting figure, which we don't have time to get into. So Henry IV got his armies, and they went and they started to beat up the Welsh. Like this, you poison the king, and you're for Richard II, and they had this sort of border wars and skirmishes and all this kind of stuff.
I wonder if they had conspiracy theorists back then like we have today, and they're the poisoning was an inside job. They just wanted an excuse to go kill the Welsh.
I'm sure there was. Yes, that stuff happened all the time.
That poisoning happened back in...
Poisoning and just people not knowing who did what, and like false flags, and like, I want to start this war against the Welsh, so maybe we'll poison the king and blame it on the Welsh. And I found a document. All that stuff did happen.
Cool.
Okay, then Richard II died.
Awesome.
Richard II then died in captivity. He died in prison, and it's unclear whether he was starved to death, whether he starved himself to death, or whether, like Shakespeare said, he was shot with a crossbow. We don't know.
How do you? He's got a crossbow bolt in his
That's
chest.
true.
It looks like he's starved.
Yeah, he ate a crossbow.
Right.
No, they don't know if he was killed. They don't know if he was killed.
Again, I feel like that's an easy
one to figure
Well,
out.
How bad were the coroners back then that they couldn't tell?
Well, I think it was that Shakespeare has him shot with a crossbow. I think in actuality he died from malnutrition, and they don't know if he went on hunger strike or if they just forgot about him and forgot to feed him.
Undercooked shellfish,
or the same shellfish. There was also a rumor that apparently maybe had some credibility that Richard II escaped and was living in captivity, but he never shows up again in the story. So who knows what happened to him? Maybe he's still out.
Still alive.
He's still out there.
Definitely.
He's on
Elvis and Tupac.
He's haunting the Veritas campus. All right. So Richard II is dead, and he doesn't really get an honorable burial because they're having this war with the Welsh, and they were for Richard, and so he's not an enemy combatant, but he's the guy we're fighting, kind of, even though he's in jail. So he doesn't really get a great burial. He's just sort of put in the ground. It's all right, see you, Richard. He was king of England, but now he's just kind of in a ditch. That's going to be important later. And 50% of the peasantry thought he was alive somewhere, and were writing blogs about where they saw him, on vacation and stuff. But Richard's dead, or at least he's out of the story. The Welsh wars continued till about 1404, and then the Scots, who saw that England was fighting with the Welsh, were like, what we're going to do? We're going to fight the English too. So the Scots got all their armies together, and they started to fight the English in the north. And so,
did they have a reason, or were they just this looks like a party?
This looks like a party. This is time. Their focus is elsewhere. We can probably get some lands back. We can steal some things. We can push our culture with our skirts and our haggis and our border collies. Mm-hmm. And so the king really leaned on an earl named of Northumberland to fight the Scots up north. Earl of Northumberland was one of the dudes that helped Henry IV become king. He was one of the guys that marched with him to take the crown. So they were friends. Earl of Northumberland also has a son who marched with Henry, who is named Henry Hotspur. Okay. So also inconveniently named Henry. So we'll refer to him as Hotspur. The reason he was called Hotspur was because he was fighting the Scots, and the Scots said, man, that guy can move real fast. And he can marshal his armies, and he can spur really quickly, and he can get from one side of the battlefield to the other, so they called him Hotspur. So Henry Hotspur is fighting...
That was conveyed upon him by his enemies?
Yes. Oh, that was pretty awesome.
That's so cool.
And Henry Hotspur is cool. He is he's definitely this bad boy of history. He's this noble warrior. He's got a super fiery temper.
But to be giving a flattering nickname by your enemies...
Yeah.
If they called you Donaldson Big Arms.
I know, yeah.
Something.
That would be great if my enemies called me Big Arms.
Sweet.
Yeah. So Henry Hotspur is up north fighting the Scots. Henry IV goes between fighting the Welsh and fighting the Scots. And but man, like Henry, the weight of the crown really does weigh on Henry. He does not want to be fighting all these wars, dealing with all of these problems. He was willing to be king. He maybe felt that he should have been king. He was probably on the like, my dad should have been king when the Black Prince died, and I should be king. But he was getting worn out. Let's see if I have. Churchill talks about this. Yes. Owen Glendower, that's the Scotsman who was a remarkable man of considerable education, carried on a war which was the constant background of English affairs till 1409. The king was also forced to fight continually against the Scots. After 6 years of this harassment, we are told that his natural magnanimity was worn out, and that he yielded himself to the temper of his supporters and of his parliament in cruel deeds. It may well be so, says Churchill.
So he just kind of gave up and let everybody.
He just sort of like was sort of henpecked by the cares and concerns of the crown to the point where his good nature turned him to be kind of like a fart. He was just like a grouch and was like, bah. And that is very much the Henry IV we see in the plays of Shakespeare, is like this grumpy, grouchy man who doesn't want to be, who's king, but he's like, this sucks. And all these wars will do that to you. All right, so Henry Hotspur came from a family known as the Percys. They are going to be an important family in this story. So Henry Percy, known as Hotspur, was fighting the Scots, and Henry IV had said, listen, I owe you guys for getting me into the crown. I owe you for fighting the Scots. There was apparently like an old debt that the Percy family had from the crown of like 60,000 pounds, which is a lot of money. And they're like, awesome, I'm glad you brought it up. Can you give us 60,000 pounds? And Henry said, I don't have 60,000 pounds. Let me go ask Parliament. Remember, because he gave Parliament all the power to like, and he's like, hey, can we get 60,000 pounds for the Percy family? They've been like top notch. They've been bros this whole time. And Parliament's like, yeah, please allow 6 to 8 weeks for processing, and we'll get back to you. Didn't happen. Right. Not getting the money. The Percy family, not happy. Henry Hotspur, a man with a temper, not happy. Meanwhile, while this was going on,
Hotspur was a Percy?
Hotspur was a Percy. Hotspur's sister married Owen Glendower, the Welsh guy who was fighting Henry IV. Oh. Just was like, this just happened. So
war, a lot of passions. There's a lot of passions in war. You see an enemy, he's fighting hard.
That's right. He's glistening. Yeah.
Is he a Welshman? Do Welshmen
he's
glisten?
Welsh. He's Welsh. Henry Hotspur's, the Percys aren't Welsh, but Owen Glendower is Welsh.
I'm sure he glistened.
I'm sure he glistened.
Welsh glisten.
Yeah. And so Hotspur's sister, I think it was, marries Owen Glendower. And so
did she have a cool nickname?
I can't remember. Now he's related by marriage to a faction that is going against his king, who just denied his family 60,000 pounds, which was owed to him.
Oh, Henry's a little flip-flop?
Henry's a little ticked. Henry Hotspur's a little ticked. Henry Hotspur then decides that he is going to join the Welsh and fight against Henry IV. And Henry IV is like, oh my goodness.
Wasn't he fighting the Scots?
He was fighting the Scots. At this point,
okay, so it wasn't like a full, I'm fighting the Welsh, now I'm not fighting the Welsh.
Yeah. No, he was fighting the Scots, and then the Scots kind of were like, went back to Scotland, and, the wars kind of waxed and waned. And then Owen Glendower was like, hey, man, I hear your king's not giving you any cash. How about since you fight with us? And Henry Hotspur was like, that's a great idea. Now, you have to remember that the north of England is... They for many periods of history see themselves as their own people, separate from the Southern English. So you have the Scots, you have the Welsh, and then you've got the Southern English of London, and then you've got this place called Northumbria, which had a lot of Viking influence. They really were not a separate culture, but they saw themselves very different. It's probably akin to like the Northerners and the Southerners in the U.S. We're one nation, but we've had troubles in the past. There's maybe different cultures between the North and the South. This is true in England as well. It's still true in England to this day.
It's still true here. Flipping banks.
Yeah. So you've got the Northumbria, and you've got the Henry Hotspur, the Percys. You've got Northumbria, who are now like have reason to be upset with the monarchy in the South again. So they decide that they are going to fight Henry IV. And Henry IV is like, flippin' heck, being king is not cool. Not chill.
Asked you for 60,000 pounds.
Yeah. Anyway, so
Oh man, can you imagine being a peasant
yeah.
roped into this whole thing that could have been so? Ugh.
yeah, So okay, where are we? So Henry IV now has a rebellion he's got to put down. So he rides up north with his army to fight the Percys, to fight Hotspur, and he takes with him his 16-year-old son, Henry, Prince of Wales.
Wait, so this is the third Henry?
Yes.
So we had Henry IV, Henry Hotspur.
Yes, Henry Hotspur, and then
Prince of Wales.
Henry Prince of Wales. We'll call him Hal because that's what he's called in Shakespeare.
Okay.
So Prince Hal rides north. Let's talk a little bit about Prince Hal's background. So when his dad was sent to France when Richard II kicked him out, and when his uncle died and Richard II took his uncle's land, Henry Prince Hal was under the care of Richard II as like a guardian, but it was.
Wait, is Hal Hotspur's kid or Henry IV?
Hal is Henry IV's kid.
Okay.
Yeah. So Hal is Henry IV's kid. He will become known as Henry V, one of the greatest kings of all time. But Prince Hal was basically like when Richard II was still king. Prince Hal was like sort of in his protection. He was a hostage. Oh. Basically, like your dad doesn't like me and your dad's exiled, but I will raise your kid for you. And so Prince Hal is like, he was with Henry as a hostage, saw some crazy stuff. But anyway, so now his dad's king.
Wait, he was with Richard
He was with Richard when Richard was king, and then when
Okay.
Richard was deposed and his dad became king, he became Prince of Wales. And he's Prince Hal. And he was sort of, traditionally, Shakespeare, he's known as having like a riotous youth. Whether or not that's true or not, we can talk about in a little bit. But he was sort of known as being like, he loved to drink. He loved drinking. He loved a good time. He wasn't a drunk. He wasn't vicious or anything, but he just loved the parties. He apparently was known for like leaving the castle and going to the pub and hanging with the bros, hanging with the peasants. And this is what Shakespeare depicts with him and Falstaff and Pistol and all these great characters of the Henriad. Anyway, Henry IV brings his son. He's like, it's about time you saw some war, kid. And so Prince Hal comes with his dad to go fight Henry Hotspur. And they have this big battle called the Battle of Shrewsbury on July 21st, 14-something. I can't remember what it was.
Oh, man, missed opportunity. Battle of
I know.
Henry, and Henry.
Yes. So the Triple Henrys.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
1403, Battle of Shrewsbury.
So the Battle of 1403. Okay, so we got the Battle of Shrewsbury. This was the first time a battle ever happened in England where Englishmen fought each other with their new technology known as the longbow. This was a technology that they didn't really like account for with their maneuvers. The longbow it could pierce armor. It could shoot way farther than normal arrows. And this battle turned into just like this absolute slaughter. Like arrows filled the air, and it was one of these battles where you realized we need to rethink the way we do war because of this new technology. Like the old way just meant that like too many important people were getting shot by arrows. It was apparently a frantic, furious bloodfest.
Why did it take so many centuries to figure out, hey, we could just make that bow bigger?
I don't know. I guess it just had to do with.
Is that not something you do on day two?
I think it was the reinforcement technique of the wood or and that kind of thing.
So it's not just making the bow longer.
It was
It's like a different type of wood with a different type of treatment.
Yeah.
Okay. I'll give him a pass.
Cool.
Okay.
So Battle of Shrewsbury. In this battle, at the end of it, there was rumors that both sides Henry had died. So people thought Henry IV was dead, and people thought that Henry Hotspur was dead.
Right.
And so the way that they because there's like all these dead bodies everywhere, and these like standards were on the ground. So the Hotspur side said, "Hey, Henry IV, are you still alive?" And he said, "Yep." "Hey, Henry Hotspur, are you still alive?" And there was silence. Henry Hotspur was dead. And what had happened was while the war was going on, while the battle was going on, Henry Hotspur was like, "Oh man, I friggin' love war. This is awesome." And he lifted up the visor of his helmet just to like take in the scene and got shot in the face with an arrow. and died.
Wait, say that again. I was looking up longbows.
Oh, Henry Hotspur got shot in the face with an arrow. He was like lifting up his visor and being like, "Man, I freaking love war," and then just like taking it all in and got an arrow right in the face.
Yes.
Took it all the way in.
Yes.
And so then he was dead. And Henry IV won. Prince Hal also took an arrow to the face.
Oh.
So Prince Hal got shot in the face with an arrow. He didn't die, but he like came back to his tent. He's like, "Dad, there's an arrow in my face." And so
Where was it? Was it like
no, it was like right, it was in his cheek apparently. And so they had this like magical apothecary. He wasn't magic, but they had this apothecary who was like trying out these new techniques of like of curing people. And so the apothecary thought, all right, well, he had a couple things. He apparently very famously used honey and alcohol to disinfect the wound, and he like cut the arrow shaft off and inserted some tool into Henry's face to like pluck the arrow out of Henry's face, and then put honey and alcohol on his wound, which was kind of apparently a pretty new technique, or this idea that like if you did this, the wound wouldn't fester, and it saved his life. And then Harry had this Prince Hal had this like awesome scar on his face, and he's like, "I got shot in the face with an arrow at the Battle of Shrewsbury," and everyone was like, "That's hardcore." 16-year-old kid, right?
Telling this story, of course, in the pubs where he would frequent.
Course. Yeah. So Prince Hal shot in the face. Henry Hotspur is dead, and Henry IV is like, "All right, are you guys done? Can we like stop with the war?" And then the Northumbrians were like, "Fine, yes, we will." Hotspur's dead. The Earl of Northumbria kind of like was like, "Fine, whatever. I won't do any more fighting. I'll just kind of like go off."
With my hot English wife.
Yeah, but he had one last kick at the can of like fighting Henry, so the Earl of Northumberland, he got the Archbishop of York. Remember, they're up in York. That's in the north. He got the Archbishop of York and a guy by the name of Thomas Mowbray. No, the Archbishop of York and Thomas Mowbray, who was the Earl of... I can't remember who he's the Earl of. Anyway, they had a big old fight with Henry. Henry eventually beat them. And this time, the Earl of Northumberland was like, "Fine, I won't fight you anymore, Henry." Henry IV took and executed the Archbishop of York and Thomas Mowbray, and people were super ticked. They're like, "You can't just kill the Archbishop of York. This is bad." And so then Henry kind of got in trouble. He's like, "Oh man, he was in rebellion against me. Of course I had to kill him." They're like, "Yeah, he's ordained by God. You can't just like cut off an archbishop's head." So that got Henry into trouble, and he kind of basically had to, he just kind of had to quell everything. But people said, "Listen, this is going to be bad for you. You killed the Archbishop of York, and God's going to, take his revenge on you." And Henry's like, "I don't know about that." Immediately gets leprosy.
Oh my God.
Really?
Oh yeah.
That's funny.
Well,
That's great.
everyone thought it was leprosy. I think modern historians look back on it and realize it was some other kind of skin disease, but everyone thought it was leprosy.
He said acne.
Yeah, it got really bad acne or something. But everyone was like, "Yeah, you killed the Archbishop of York. Of course you're getting leprosy."
Oh man, I would love if it was just like ringworm.
Yeah. But anyway, so Henry IV now was like sick and had leprosy, and he thought it was because he killed the like God's man on earth.
Right.
And the cares of the crown are weighing heavy on him. And his kid is acting up. Henry IV was like, "Check out my cool scar, and I'm going to be king one day." And he's like this fiery, like gregarious kid that just wants to...
Is it Henry IV?
This is Henry V.
Fifth,
So
eventually.
Henry IV's kid is like acting up and wants, is like, "Dad, let me take on the family business. You say all the time that the crown is like heavy and you don't want to wear it. Like, let me do some stuff." And his dad was like, no, it's my crown. Unfortunately, as the years went on, Henry IV kind of got really like possessive and almost like conspiratorial and a little bit they're out to get me. The nurses are stealing from me, like that kind of guy. And he kind of butted heads with Henry V, and Henry V was like, "I'm going to be king one day. You can't stop it. Why don't you just let me do it now?" And Henry IV was like, "No, it's my crown." And it kind of got into that towards the end of Henry IV's life. Wasn't great. And again, he was just worn out. He basically let Parliament govern. Prince Hal was not happy with that. He's like, "You can't let Parliament do everything. We're freaking kings. Like we should rule. We should have authority." And Henry IV just sort of like, kind of just was not crushed, but he was definitely had the joy of life drained from him because of the cares of the crown. And then he eventually dies. He dies.
That's so depressing.
I know. He's not an old man, but he dies. He had leprosy, and he dies, and Henry V becomes king. But this is how Churchill ends the section on Henry IV when he's dead. This is sort of the moral that Churchill says about Henry IV. He died on March 20th, 1413. Thus the life and reign of King Henry IV exhibit to us another instance of the vanities of ambition and the harsh guerdon which rewards its success. It's a word I can never pronounce. He had had wrongs to avenge and a cause to champion, getting his lands back. He had hardly dared at first to aim at the crown, but he had played the final stake to gain it. He had found it less pleasing when possessed. Not only physically, but morally he sank under its weight. His years of triumph were his years of care and sorrow. But none can say he had not reason and justice behind his actions, or that he was not accepted by the country at large. Upon his death, a new personality, built upon a grand historic scale, long hungry for power, ascended without dispute to the throne not only of England, but very soon of almost all Western Christendom. Okay, so that's the end of Henry IV and the rise of Henry V. So, Henry V, he becomes king. And like I said, Shakespeare said that he was like, a lot of the Henriads, so Henry IV and Henry V, is the story of Prince Hal going from like riotous youth to serious man. And there's probably some truth to that in the life of Henry V. But Henry V was always a pretty serious and kind of like even-handed guy. At this time, the Lombards were big in England. This was a Christian heresy. They were basically like communists. Like that's what they wanted. They wanted equal distribution of all property. That was part of their heresy. And so there was a lot of persecution of the Lombards. Henry IV did it. There was once when young Prince Hal, before he was king, was witness and basically like the judge over this Lombard who was going to be burned at the stake. And he's like, hey man, like you should recant. You're going to be burned alive. You should just recant and like go back to your home and like do your thing. Just like just recant. And the Lombard's like, no, never. And Henry's like, okay, I'm going to come back later. I'm going to let you think about it. I'm going to come back later. Came back a couple days later. He's like, listen, are you going to recant? And the Lombard's like, I'd rather burn. And so Henry's like, fine. And the Lombard burned to death. Now, whether or not you think that's a story that shines well in Henry V, it does at least show that he tried to give him an out.
Right.
He was at least even-handed. He's like, it doesn't have to go this way. And the Lombard was like, equal property or whatever, and and was burned to death. When Henry IV takes over the realm, he has this sort of feeling of like, listen, we had this big fight with Richard and my dad. We had the fight with Henry Hotspur. Guys, that was bad. That sucked. What we should do instead is we should go fight other people. We should take all that hot energy that we have that of wanting to kill each other, and we should go kill someone else.
France.
We should. Yes, we should. We should. His idea was we should go attack France,
Hey.
and when that's done, we should go on crusade, boys.
Ooh.
We got it. And so there was this sort of mood shift when Henry V became king. There was kind of a shift in England where they're like, all right, this guy is clearly able. He's got a wicked awesome scar from getting shot in the face. He is gregarious. He is even-keeled. He's tall. He's handsome. He's everything a king should be. Let's give him a chance. Let's put aside our petty differences and let's not fight each other. This is what Churchill says about this time. In the surging realm, with its ailing king, bitter factions, and deep social and moral unrest, all men had for some time looked to him, Henry V. And succeeding generations have seldom doubted that, according to the standards of his day, he was all that a king should be. His face, we are told, was oval, with a long straight nose, ruddy complexion, dark smooth hair, and bright eyes, mild as a dove when unprovoked, but lion-like in wrath. His frame was slender, yet well knit, strong and active. His disposition was orthodox, chivalrous, and just. He came to the throne at a moment when England was wearied of feuds and brawls and yearned for unity and fame. He led the nation away from the internal discord to foreign conquest. And he had the dream and perhaps the prospect of leading all Western Europe into the high championship of a crusade. Council and Parliament alike showed themselves suddenly bent on war with France. As was even then usual in England, they wrapped up in phrases of the opposite import. So they're like, they don't say we should fight France. The Lords knew well, they said, that the king will attempt nothing that is not to the glory of God, and will eschew the shedding of Christian blood. If he goes to war, the cause will be the renewal of his rights, not his own willfulness. Bishop Beaufort opened the session of 1414 with a sermon upon "Strive for the truth unto death," and the exhortation, "While we have time, let us do good to all men." This was understood to mean the speedy invasion of France. So, oh man, I love Churchill. So, everything coalesced on invading France. So meanwhile in France was going through some hard
Do
times.
they have a reason for invading France? Is there what you said, a restoration of rights?
Yes. So there was, you'll have to go back and re-listen to the old Plantagenets, but for a long time, England owned a lot of the northern realm of France, of Brittany, and of what we would know as Normandy. And that was their realm. It was lost by King John's soft sword. He lost it all.
Or Lackland?
Yeah, Lackland, that's right. And so there was always this claim like, listen, we got to go back and get some of the continent. That's ours, boys. And so we're going to go back and get it. There was even like a really, really tenuous claim that Henry had on the actual crown of France. Really tenuous. And he's like, but I'm going to go become king of France. So they invade France. They mobilize. They get everything going. Let's talk a little bit about what's happening in France at this time. France had a king, Charles the Sixth. Charles the Sixth was known as Charles the Mad, or Charles the Crazy, or Crazy King Charles. Because
all those names seem to tender on a theme.
Yeah,
Yes.
I'm picking up on a trend.
Something happened where Charles VI had a mental break, where one day, and it was actually quite crazy. One day he was riding out with his entourage in France, and something snapped, and he just took out his sword and he just went crazy and started killing all his friends in madness. Wow. And he killed 5 of them before they basically stopped him. And something, they don't know what it was. He just went mad. There was times where they just locked him in his castle and he would escape. And so they actually walled him in the castle. Wow. They actually put bricks over the door, and every once in a while chambermaids would go and check on him. And when chambermaids found him, he was naked and covered in his own feces in the royal hall. Clearly he had some kind of mental breakdown.
Oh, he's just totally bananas.
And they had no idea what happened to him.
So he's in charge.
He's in charge of France. Now, every once in a while, he would kind of pull it together and he'd show up and he'd be like, "Hey guys, what's up?" And they'd be like, "You look well." And then he would rule for a little bit, and then he would have these episodes and they'd have to wall him back in the castle again. And there was a period of time where he thought he was a window, and he didn't want anybody to come near to him because he thought he was going to shatter. Okay. And so they're like, "Okay, you can stay inside the castle." And so he's the king of France. Well, what do you think is happening to the kingdom while Charles VI is walled up in his own castle?
Chaos?
Yeah.
Sure.
Not great. So there are 2 strong factions that are vying for power. You have the House of Orleans and the House of Burgundy. We don't need to get too much into it. But the House of Burgundy was the weaker house, and they were the one that kind of had ties with England.
Of wine fame?
Of wine fame, that's right. And so they had ties with England, and they were the weaker of the house. The House of Orleans was the stronger of the house. And they did not like each other. They hated each other. There was this famous scene where they tried to have a peace treaty and they got together on a bridge and they almost signed the peace treaty. And one guy was like, "I just can't do it," and just killed somebody. Not great. They did not like each other. Henry V came to the Duke of Burgundy and said, "Hey, listen, how about I invade France and help you out in this whole dispute?" And Burgundy's like, "Cool, yeah, awesome. What do you want in return?" He's like, "You recognize me as King of France?" And Burgundy's like, Yeah, okay, that's fine. We'll do that. Fine. You're king of France. And Henry's like, yes. So Henry invades France and immediately has immediate success. He goes and he invades and takes over the city of Honfleur, which used to be English, or however you want to call it, back in the day, 100 years ago. They take Honfleur. This is the battle where we get the famous "once more into the breach, dear friends." And he takes Honfleur, and it's this glorious victory, and everyone's like, holy crap, Henry V is amazing. He's way better than crazy Charles VI. Maybe he should be king of France.
Oh, like the people in Honfleur?
Yeah, because they also had ties to England, right? Because they were English, or they were part of the English crown for a long time.
So they're like, sweet, at least he's not thinking he's a window.
That's right. At least he doesn't think he's a window. And then, so Henry V took over Honfleur, and then the Dauphin, which is the Prince of France, Charles VI's kid, who's going to be known as Charles VII. So we'll just call him the Dauphin. The Dauphin got his army together to go stop Henry. You can't take over Honfleur. You can't go take over stuff. The Dauphin gets his army.
Somebody's got to do something about this.
Somebody's got to do something about this. So he goes and he takes his army and he goes up to stop Henry. Henry writes the Dauphin a letter and he's like, listen, we could fight and you could lose in battle. Or how about we settle this man to man and we have a fight to the death? And the Dauphin gets this letter and is like, no, I'm not going to do that. That sounds terrible. I'm going to fight to the death. Henry's awesome.
Right.
But that's so cool.
That is really cool.
So he insists the Dauphin that they should have single combat to end the war, and the Dauphin says no. And word gets out that the Dauphin said no, and Henry wanted to do this, and all the ladies.
He's risking all the...
That's right.
He's risking all his men.
All right,
if I was like one of the French dudes, I'd be like, come on, man. Like,
I know.
You can solve it on your own. I don't have to involve me.
So all the ladies of the realm are like, Henry V is kind of awesome. And the Dauphin is kind of like a wuss. Mm-hmm. And, but the Dauphin does have the bigger army.
All the French ladies too, they're like zut.
Yeah, exactly. But the Dauphin does have superiority of army. He does have, he probably, it was a good move because the Dauphin was going to win. He had way superior numbers. Henry has this English Channel that he's got to get supplies, right? He's cut off from his home base. He's in a weaker position. They take Honfleur. There is an old castle of Calais that Henry really wants to get back. And so he's like, listen, I'm going to take like 4,000 knights and a bunch of archers, and we're going to march on Calais. And he sends the rest of his army back to another place by boat. Or no, I think he sends the army by boat to sort of camp outside Calais, and he's going to march on Calais from the land to be able to take it. And so he sends the bulk of his army by boat to Calais, and he is going to march through the north of France to get to Calais with 4,000 knights and a bunch of archers. He's also basically goading the Dauphin into a battle because he's just thinned his forces and he's going to walk through France. The Dauphin sends him a letter and says, "I'm going to kill you." Henry says, "Listen, I'm just going to Calais. Leave me alone. I'm just going to take my castle.
Just taking one of your cities. It's
I'm
not
just
a big
taking
deal.
Calais. It was
not a big deal.
It was always been ours. Just back off." And the Dauphin was following him with his army. There was really bad rain. A bunch of bridges were washed out. Henry really had to go into deeper France in order to get to Calais. And he got to this point where he was so deep into France that he gets cut off from the rest of his army by the Dauphin. He's trapped. The Dauphin has outflanked him. The Dauphin has massive 20,000 troop armies between him and Calais and the rest of his troops. Henry's screwed. Everyone's kind of that night. The Dauphin's on one side, and the legend has it that night the Dauphin and his troops had a raucous party where they all got super drunk and they decided how they were going to divvy up the spoils of the coming day.
That's never a herald of bad things.
Right. And Henry V, his army were very somber and very quiet and didn't light any fires and sort of sat and were and just sort of prayed to God. There's a great scene of this in the play Henry V. The day dawns where the battle is going to take place, and it is actually a holiday. It was St. Crispin's Day in England, and so there's a lot of people who are going to be working that day. And one of Henry V's a dude said, "Oh man, I wish all of those men who weren't working in England were here fighting with us. Then we would stand a chance." And Henry says this. This is the famous speech that Henry gives before what is going to be known
This is from Shakespeare
as
or
the
from-
Battle of Agincourt.
Did he actually give this speech, or was
This
this
is
just
Shakespeare's speech.
Okay.
So this is like, you know, they're going to die. And Henry stands up and he gives this famous speech.
According to Shakespeare, or
According
did
to
he
Shakespeare.
actually give this?
He apparently gave a rousing speech, and Shakespeare writes out what his speech was. Like, Shakespeare gives his version of the speech.
Okay.
There is a speech that's kind of lost to history that has elements of it, and so this was a speech.
Okay.
Good morning. In less than an hour, aircrafts from here will join others from around the world, and you will be launching the largest aerial battle in the history of mankind. Mankind. That word should have new meaning for us all today. We can't be consumed by our petty differences anymore. We will be united in our common interests. Perhaps it's fate that today is the 4th of July, and you will once again be fighting for our freedom, not from tyranny, oppression, or persecution, but from annihilation. We're fighting for our right to live, to exist. And should we win today, the 4th of July will no longer be known as an American holiday, but as the day when the world declared with one voice, we will not go quietly into the night. We will not vanish without a fight. We're going to live on. We're going to survive. Today we celebrate our Independence Day.
I don't think that's the speech.
What? I mean, it was similar.
Roughly.
It was roughly like that.
Yeah. Well, welcome to Earth.
Yes.
Okay, no, that was a speech from President Whitmore. Was it Whitmore? I can't remember his name. The President's speech on Independence Day.
Independence
Another great speech. No,
Equally great speech.
equally great speech. So I'm actually, since we're at the hour mark, this is where we're gonna end. We're gonna end at
this
the
speech?
eve of the battle. No, we're gonna end at the eve of the Battle of Agincourt. We'll start the next one with this speech.
You're not going to give the speech?
No, we'll get the speech at the beginning of the next one.
Bro.
But so here's where Henry
I'm
is.
crushed.
So Henry is cut off from the rest of his army. He's gone deep into France. The Dauphin has basically, I think, 4 or 5 to 1 odds against Henry's troops. And even if Henry wins the battle, he's still on the other side of the army. This is rough. This is sort of bad.
in a bad spot.
Everybody thought that they were going to die. And Henry, yes, we'll start off the podcast with the speech he gives to his men, and we will talk about the greatest victory that the English, probably one of the greatest military victories that the English have ever had at the Battle of Agincourt. So, you're probably thinking, well, I thought the War of the Roses was like this terrible, bloody affair. But I mean, we are at the height. This is probably the apex of British chivalry, and this is probably the highest level of the Plantagenet dynasty is Henry V and what happens after this battle. And then, so that is, we will move on. Next week, we will talk, or next time, we'll talk about the Battle of Agincourt and how Henry V becomes the heir to the Kingdom of France.
Oh, man, I'm excited. I love this series. Well, thank you, Graeme. I can't wait to hear the speech. And so this has been Classical Stuff You Should Know. You can find us at classicalstuff.net. You can email us at theguys@classicalstuff.net and tweet at us at CLSSCAL stuff. And you can also patronize us. If you like what you hear, if you want to, you can throw us a couple bucks. If you want to pay 10 or more, you get all kinds of in-between episodes, which are getting longer and longer. Like we sometimes go half an hour, and sometimes...
Well, we have our AMAs that are hour and a half, right?
Yeah, we have AMAs you can also hear that are an hour and a half. And if you want to hear in-between episodes, sometimes we get into discussions that we have either continue into the in-between episodes or have only in the in-between episodes. And if you want access to those, it's just $10 a month. And yeah, so thank you to our Patreon supporters, and thank you for listening, supporter or not. We're just happy to have you here. All right, and that's it for us. We'll see you next time. This is Classical Stuff out.
Ciao.
Bye.